Hey everyone, so in this video I'm going to go over chapter 17 that we are covering here in week 2. All right, so this is our first chapter, our introduction to poetry. Go ahead here. So chapter 17 is, again, just sort of an introduction to poetry, and it's how do I read poetry? Because poetry, while it can be a very lovely thing, it can also be kind of tricky, and it can be intimidating for a lot of people. And we're not going to spend, a big chunk of the term on poetry, but we are covering it here at the beginning of the term, but it will show up on the first exam, the drama and poetry exam. So we're going to start off with a real quick PowerPoint, just kind of getting you into that space where you can start to read and understand poetry a little better. So the first thing that you really need to do when you're reading a poem is to figure out the literal meaning first. Don't necessarily worry about all the poetic stuff yet. Don't worry about similes and metaphors and symbols and imagery and figures of speech or any of that stuff. The first thing you want to do is obtain the literal meaning so that you know what is actually happening in the poem. There'll be another step where you start to think about those poetic elements and figuring out what else is going on. But the first thing you have to do is just make sure you literally understand what is happening in the poem. So you want to start by reading it out loud if you can. It can help, or at least by sounding the words out in your mind, like being intentional about hearing the words in your head, if you're not in a place where you could read it out loud. Kind of pay attention to rhyme and rhythm while you're reading it, because they can work to sort of emphasize key words or to draw our attention to something. Not all poems rhyme. Not all poems have a distinct rhythm. But if the poem you happen to be reading does, then there is probably a reason for that. It was an intentional choice on the poet's part. So kind of picking up on the rhyme and rhythm as you're reading it can help you sort of remember where, those rhymes seemed significant, where the rhythm, because especially like if you've got a rhythm going on and then suddenly the rhythm stops, that's probably an important element of the poem. There's something going on there. But reading it out loud can help you pick up on the rhyme and rhythm, because when we're looking at words on a page, we don't necessarily always hear that they rhyme. We don't necessarily notice that right away. And we don't necessarily pick up on the rhythm either. It's not until we're reading it out loud or hearing it in our mind that we can pick up on those things. Go slowly. Pay attention to every word. I think every author, published author, is very particular about every word they use on the page, but with poetry especially, word choice is super intentional. Like there is a reason why this poet used these specific words, because especially if you think about, like the word happy, there are so many synonyms for the word happy, so many different ways that we could express that same idea. Why did the poet choose the particular word they chose to express that idea? There's a reason. Look up any words that you aren't sure of. We're going to be reading a couple of items that are not of our contemporary world. They're not like ancient, but they're not, super modern either. And so there might be some words in there that we don't use as much anymore. And so we might not be as familiar with them. So look up words if you need to. And then if there is any section of the poem that was confusing that you couldn't quite figure out, go back to it. Read, if it's a short poem, keep reading the poem over and over. If it's a longer poem and it's just like one section that isn't quite clicking yet, go back and just keep looking at that part. See if you can figure it out. But reading it out loud is going to force you to sort of interpret the words and phrases. We can sort of read on autopilot. And when you're forced to say it out loud, your brain stops and tries to figure out what you're saying, what it means. So again, reading it out loud is super helpful. Getting the literal meaning first, right? So what do we mean by that? It means paraphrase it. Go line by line. What is happening in this line? What does this line say? Put it in your own words. What does this line say? And the next line. Paraphrase it, line by line. This can help you not only make sure you understand what is actually happening in the poem, but then picking up on other elements along the way. But really, just go line by line and paraphrase it. Get the literal meaning. Think about syntax. Syntax refers to the order of our words in a sentence. We have a pretty standard expectation when it comes to syntax. Subject, verb, object, maybe some adjectives thrown in there, maybe some prepositional phrases thrown in there. But, it's still a pretty standard pattern that we're used to. Poets will put words together in very unusual ways. And I have an example here that says, "And why unblooms the best hope ever sown?" Why unblooms the best hope ever sown? That's a very weird way of asking a question. The words are not in the order that we are accustomed to. So you have to put it in sort of our normal syntax. That question, the way we would ask it, would read, "And why does the best hope ever sown not bloom?" Right? Unblooms, not bloom. Right? So looking at the syntax, especially if something is a section of a poem or a whole poem is confusing to you, the syntax could really be a big reason why you're struggling with it. So you really have to look at each line or each thought, because a complete thought in poetry might take 3 lines of the poem, right? And the other confusing thing is that poets sometimes leave words out, and we kind of got to fill in the blanks, right? Thinking about normal syntax again. Oh, what word did they leave out? The way we would normally say it. Punctuation. Sometimes they don't use punctuation. So, when we're reading like a short story or a paragraph, we know that a single thought, starts at the beginning of a sentence and ends at the period or the question mark or the exclamation point, right? And we could have a complex sentence, a compound sentence that combines, 2 or more thoughts, but we still kind of have the punctuation to help us figure it out. That's not always there in poetry. Poets can, excuse me, sometimes they don't use punctuation at all. Sometimes it's used in very weird ways. Occasionally, though, you will have a poet that's using punctuation to actually help us understand how ideas are connected. But so putting it sort of in your own words, line by line, in order to do that, you have to think about syntax and punctuation. And keeping in mind that, again, a thought, a full thought in poetry is often more than just a line of the poem. That thought might start on line 1, but doesn't finish until the end of line 4 or midway through line 3. And then a new thought starts, a new sentence begins. So that can help you sift through what's happening in the poem so that you can understand it better. That is definitely one of the things that trips us up the most with poetry, is not thinking about how poets convey their thoughts, how the speaker is conveying an idea or what they're sharing with us. We tend to think that one line is a thought, and then the next line is a different thought. And that can mess you up if it's actually lines 1 and 2 go together as one thought. It can really be hard when you've got 5 lines that make up one thought, and we have to read the whole thing just as we would read a regular sentence. Hold on for a moment. Hold on. Quiet, please. These boys. Quiet, please. They're 7 and 8. They're quite loud. So, going line by line at first, but keeping in mind that, to really figure out what is being said, you might have to consider a group of lines, just like you would read a single sentence if it was like in a paragraph form, right? Okay. So once you kind of understand the literal meaning, or think you do, hopefully you're there, then you can start to go into those more like poetic elements. Who is the speaker? Who is being addressed in the poem? This, is this a moment where like someone is speaking to another person? Is the audience, the readers, a part of a different group? Like, is this clearly meant for parents? Is it meant for grandparents? Is it meant for doctors? Is it meant for people who have served in the military, or people who haven't served in the military, to show them what it's like to have served in the military? Things like that. Who is being addressed? What is the message? What is the underlying message that the poet is trying to convey to us? What do they want us to walk away with? What do the images contribute? Poetry is typically full of imagery. What do symbols suggest, right? And we'll talk more about all of these things here in a bit. And how does it all fit together? All right. So some questions to ask yourself as you're reading, after you have finished reading, maybe when you're going back to reread it. Can you paraphrase the poem? Have you gone line by line for a literal meaning? Who is the speaker? Not the poet. Who is the speaker? And how would you describe this persona? For instance, we'll talk a lot about persona when we get to chapter 18, but just to give you sort of an example, when I was younger, junior high, I wrote a poem. Yes, I fancied myself a poet. I wrote a poem that was from the point of view of a man on death row. Well, obviously, that's not me. I'm the poet. The speaker of the poem was this man on death row. I created a persona, not me. So who is the speaker of the poem, and how would you describe this persona? Just like you would describe a person that you know in real life, like they're kind, they're generous, or they're arrogant, they're sarcastic, they're grumpy, they're, how would you describe the persona that has been created in this poem? What is the speaker's tone? Just like a person has a tone of voice, what words reveal the tone? Is it perhaps ironic, the tone? Think about the word choices. Are there any heavily connotative words? Connotation means a word that, you can look the meaning up in the dictionary and you'll get the dictionary definition of it. But culturally, we have added meaning to that word, like the word white. White is just a color on the spectrum. And that's what you're going to see when you look it up in the dictionary. It's going to be about the color. But culturally, what kind of associations do we have with the word white, the color white? There's all kinds, right? So again, word choice is super important, especially in poetry. So if a word has a lot of associations with it, there's a reason it was used. Those associations mean something. Are any words or phrases repeated? That's a clue that they're important, that they're trying to point something out. And again, what words do you need to look up? What images does the poet use? How do those images relate to one another? Do they form a pattern, which is called a motif? Is there one central controlling image throughout the poem? Again, we're going to learn more about imagery as well. What figures of speech are used? Similes, metaphors, personification, things like that. How do they contribute to the tone and the meaning? Are there any symbols? And if there are any symbols, are they universal symbols? Meaning like, is it a symbol that even taken away, out of the poem and, it would still be that same symbol? Or has the poet created a symbol within the poem? Meaning like, if we were to read something with that same symbol in something else, it wouldn't be a symbol anymore. How important is the form? We're not going to get too much into this. We are going to look at one sonnet, but form isn't necessarily something we're going to spend a lot of time on. But you do want to sort of look at the rhyme scheme and how the lines are arranged. That is that can still, even if you don't know what it's formally called, what the form is formally, you can still look and say, okay, well, they've broken it down into, sets of 4 lines or sets of 2 lines, right? And see if that contributes to the meaning of the poem or the effect of the poem, right? So that chapter 17, just some tips and tricks and some advice on how to approach poetry. And again, reading it out loud can be super helpful. Go line by line and paraphrase it. Put it in your own words, and that'll force you a little bit to really think about what's being said, what the words say. But keep in mind that syntax and punctuation can be tricky. And so you have to think about that as you are paraphrasing and trying to figure out the literal meaning. Then you can start asking yourself some of those additional questions. And in the next chapter, in the next lesson on chapter 18, we're going to get into some of those elements of poetry. Chapter 18 is really more about persona and tone. And then next week, when we do chapter 19, we will get into like similes and metaphors and imagery and, different figures of speech. Okay. All right. So that's it for chapter 17. If you have questions, feel free to reach out. Otherwise, you can go ahead and move on to the next lesson.